Thank you so much. This is an interview conducted by myself, Emma Cieslik, on Friday, March 19th at 10 o'clock a.m. for the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. I use she, her pronouns. We are recording this video via Zoom due to COVID-19 regulations while I sit in the Burkhart Building at Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana. I wanted to sincerely thank you for your time and for agreeing to participate and contribute to the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. Starting off, can you please introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Emma. My name is Morgan Roddy, and I use she, her pronouns as well. I've lived in Muncie since the end of 2016, and I'm the current owner of Queer Chocolatier.
Wonderful. Going along with that, would you mind please sharing your age?
Yes, I am 41 years old.
Wonderful. When and where were you born?
I was born in Indianapolis, Indiana, and my hometown is a town just southwest of Indianapolis called Mooresville. That's where I graduated high school.
Wonderful. And I'm curious, going along with that, what were the names of the schools that you attended for primary and secondary education?
For sure. So part of my early childhood education was disrupted. I can get into that later. But I graduated elementary school at Waverly Elementary, and our junior high was a junior high, not a middle school. It's called Paul Hadley. He also designed the state flag, if that matters. That's why it's called Paul Hadley. And then I graduated Mooresville High School in 1998.
Wonderful. And I think this goes along with exploring more about your childhood. Where did you grow up?
Sure. I grew up in a small town called Waverly. And so that is kind of an interesting little small space because I went to and had a phone number that was Mooresville, but I had a Martinsville address. So I was kind of in a small town of like not incorporated space, really.
And I'm curious, I know you mentioned an early education disruption. Would you mind sharing more about that?
Sure, it's a very long story. Um, so my mom is a single parent, and my grandparents had three kids. So it was my uncle, then my mom is the middle child, and then my aunt, who was 4 years younger than my mom. And my mom was 19 when she had me. So I kind of find it interesting that I'm both an only child from my mom, but I'm kind of the youngest of four because my grandparents were my primary caretakers. But there was a period of time when my mother was wanted by law enforcement, and she fled the state with me. So there was a lot of times in my second grade year, really, where we were in shelters or we were in motels, and sometimes I was enrolled in school and sometimes I wasn't. So basically, like in my second grade to third grade year, there was a lot of volatility there.
Yes. And I'm curious, going along with that, can you tell me more about your family of origin?
Sure. So I'm the only child of my mom, and I do not know my dad, nor did she. And then my grandparents, my mom's name is Catherine. She went by Kathy, still goes by Kathy. And then my grandma and grandpa are Dorothy and Richard. Dorothy Madewell is her maiden name, and Richard Roddy. They're both from Tennessee, but from different parts of Tennessee. My grandpa was in the Air Force, and so my uncle was born in Bedfordshire, England. My mom was born in Austin, Texas, outside of the Air Force Base there. And then my aunt was born in Indianapolis. And basically, when my aunt was born, they kind of settled here in Indiana. That's where you get me from here. And then my grandpa's mom and dad were Stella Hill and J.H. John Roddy. They were in the just southeast of Chattanooga area in a place called Hickson. There's also nearby is a place called Saudi Daisy, Tennessee, which has grown up to be a pretty big suburb now, but at first it was just two hollows in the wood, basically. And then my grandma is from McMinnville, Tennessee, which is eastern, kind of east central Tennessee. And her dad was Gilbert Madewell, and her mom is Eula Locke Bryant, Bryant being her married name, Locke is her maiden. Grandma's one of four kids. Grandpa is one of several kids. My great grandfather had a couple of different wives, so he had like extended family. And so yeah, that's like those are the people that I knew in my family. My aunt does not have any kids. My uncle has a few kids, two adopted daughters from his wife's previous marriage, and then they had two bio kids. So I have four cousins, and they are all settled in southern Indiana.
Wonderful. And going along with that, are there any particular relationships that have shaped your life in significant ways?
Sure. So my grandparents were again like my primary caretakers in a lot of ways. They divorced when I was young. So my grandmother was kind of a motherly figure, but not necessarily like that. I'll give you hard candy grandma, but more like a I'll show you what's up grandma. Um, but she was very good, very kind, and always a supporter. And then my grandpa was always very supportive as well in my like, did you get your homework done? Let's go to practice for sports. So they were very supportive both, but they were separate. My mom, I call pretty negligent. And actually, after my grandparents passed away, my grandma passed away in 2002, and my grandpa in 2004. After my grandpa passed away, I estranged myself from my mother. My grandparents kind of were the buffer to kind of protect me from my mother in a lot of ways, mostly in terms of the fact that she would want financial resources a lot, and so they would be the go-betweens. But once they were gone, I realized space mattered, both physical and relational space. So that shaped me, the absence of that space, or the absence of that relationship. I'm not really too close to my uncle. He didn't seem to really enjoy that we had a first Black president in 2008, so we've kept separate from that. And then my aunt is the one I'm probably the closest to right now. She is also gay, so we have like an understanding of each other that's probably different than the rest of my family. My grandmother's mother, my great grandma, she passed away in 2010. She was my best friend. So she was definitely like the person who I bonded closest with in my family, especially after my grandma passed away. So she outlived two of her kids actually, and that was really hard on her. So I know I can't replace them, but I try to be more engaged in relational conversations and visits and all that good stuff. And we became very good friends with that. So my great grandma, my aunt, those are probably like the two core people in my family that I was very closest with.
Thank you. And going along with that, I was curious, I know you had a close relationship with your aunt who also identified as gay. Would you mind sharing more about how she shaped your understandings of sexuality throughout your childhood and your adulthood?
Sure. I would say she really didn't. And I would say that the conversations didn't really come about in any way about sexuality when I was a child. And like, the only reason I learned about my only exposure to sex ed was a book my mom gave me when I was in third grade, and then whatever sex ed was in school. So we didn't have any conversations. And the only the only bit of conversation I'd ever have with anybody else in my family, my grandpa would say, as I'm leaving the house with maybe friends, he'd say, "Don't get pregnant." Like, okay, I won't. And then that was basically like, "Hey, I'll come back after movies today." And he's like, "Don't get pregnant." And I'm like, "Okay, I can promise that." But it wasn't for me with any understanding of like sexuality. It was just don't be engaging in sexual intercourse. So I think he maybe assumed that I was straight. But at the time, I mean, it wasn't until I was in my 20s really that I even engaged in any sort of sexual activity. So I would say that I probably was very asexual up to that point. I just wasn't interested in it. What shaped me most was not so much my aunt being queer, but the idea of not being my mom internalized in me not to have a kid. So I basically did not want to have any relationships with anybody. So it was like a weird, rigid boundary I held for myself for a very long time. And that probably shaped my sexuality in its own way more than anybody else did, really.
Most definitely. And going along with that, can you tell me more about your family now and who you identify as your family now?
Sure. So chosen family obviously is a very big thing. So far as my relationships, my current family, it is really just my aunt and me. There's some distant relations that we'll check in on each other a little bit, but they're just very distant relations. It's positive, but it's not substantial. But my aunt and I, we speak probably a few times a month. But my chosen family, I have people who I call like my adopted mom and stepmom and adopted dad and stepdad. Those are my best friend's parents and step parents. So Keelan is one of my very best friends, and I met Keelan when I was in college. And she's a few years older than I am, and she has an older brother. And they're both from Maine. And then, but their parents are all Rhode Islanders. So their mom and dad are from Rhode Island. Their stepmom is from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then their stepdad is from northern Indiana. So when Keelan's mom, Paula, divorced Henry, they each remarried to Mary Frances and to Bob. But all four parents get along well, and they all get along with their kids. And at first, it wasn't that way because that's how divorce works. But they're all really even keeled and good family now. And Paula and Bob live in Indianapolis, so they're the folks that I would see more regularly. And then I'll make trips to go see my family in Maine. Is basically how I call it. So I'll go visit Henry and Mary Frances up in Maine, and so they're people who I've chosen to be like my parental family in a lot of ways. But now when I talk about chosen family here in Muncie, I have a lot of people that I consider that would be sibling in a lot of ways. And then now that I've had Queer Chocolatier, I collect people as like nibblings, I call them. So like they're like my niece, my nephew, my nibblings. So I have a lot of people that I've collected that are a generation younger than me that I feel like they're my family. They may not reciprocate it, but that's not contingent on me. I just care for them in that sort of way.
And I'm curious going along with that. I know you mentioned siblings in the area. How did a lot of those relationships develop and how did you grow close to those people?
Sure. So I consider myself pretty extroverted, and I love to connect with people as often as I can. Pandemic notwithstanding, of course, but I think we find ourselves in common spaces, and then those friendships will start, or people I know may know somebody else and connect people. So it's either a shared space or shared networks that I think will bring those people together. And generally, once somebody is a friend of mine, they're pretty close. And then if we deepen that relationship, I think probably because I'm an only child, I latch onto the sibling nature a lot. So I mean, I'm very affectionate with my platonic friends, and I am very quick to say I love you. And it's colloquially we'll say fam or sis or bro, whatever it is. So yeah, I think it's just in Muncie, it's a small space network wise. It's a average sized town as far as I can tell, but like it feels small and cozy when you have those small networks that just become more rich and valuable in their interactions.
Wonderful. And going along with that, I was curious to ask, I know you grew up with your grandparents as your primary caregivers. Was your family religious growing up?
No, I didn't have any religious influence, and I often will describe myself as unchurched. So whenever I was young, I didn't experience church. My grandparents being from Tennessee, I'm sure they went to church as children, but they either didn't care continue that, or they were maybe adamant against it. I don't know. It never really was a conversation, religion at all. So it was like one of those things that nobody told me religion was good or religion was bad. It was just an absence. Now, my uncle, though, once he got married to his wife, Barbara, um, I think she must have been religious at some point, and I don't know the story behind that, but he became a pastor of the Nazarene church when the two of them moved down to southern Indiana, but then he also left the church. So I don't know how much of that was maybe uh, her influence on him, and maybe he outgrew it or whatever the case was, but that was not a factor in my growing up at all. And it only became aware to me that I did not have religion when I went to Marian College, which is a Catholic college. So going to a Catholic school and not being Catholic, that was the only time I felt different with regard to religion.
I'm curious, would you mind sharing more about your time at Marian College and what you studied and what attracted you to the university?
For sure. So it's kind of funny to me because in hindsight, I see maybe what happened, but I didn't see it in the time. I applied only to two schools. I applied to Ball State for an undergrad, and I applied to Marian College. And the only reason I applied to Ball State was my intention was to be a high school art teacher. So I thought teaching in Ball State. And then I applied to Marian College because their track and field coach recruited me, but I didn't know anything about the university or the college itself. My mom didn't go to college. My grandpa had maybe an associate's degree that he got while he was in the Air Force. My grandma didn't go to college. My uncle went to Ball State, but I never heard anything about that. I feel a lot of ways a first generation college student because I didn't have any of that higher education influence. Um, but I never heard from Ball State when I was young. I never heard, and it made me think my mom might have went through my mail and did not let me know that I was accepted or denied to Ball State. But I was accepted to Marian College, and the main draw was me being on the track and field team in college. But I think my mom's influence was Ball State was far away and Marian was close, and so I think that fed into that. Um, but I enjoyed my time at Marian, and growing up in Mooresville and not really having any perspective of the world beyond Mooresville in a lot of ways. I figured you go to college, you get your degree, you come back home and you pick your job. That is literally what I thought school was. And so I actually am a very kind of spiteful person in a lot of ways. And I had an art teacher I didn't like. And I was like, I cannot wait to get my art degree so I can come back and take your job. Like that's how I thought it worked. So I went to Marian, and my degree was in fine art. I enrolled in the education program, but I did not complete the education program because all my intention was to be a high school art teacher, and I didn't want to do primary school at all. But in Indiana, the licensure for art teacher is K through 12, and so I didn't have like all the K through 8 training, and I didn't want to take it. So I said, well, I've got my bit that I want, and that's all, and I'm just going to let the teaching part of it go. But I got my art degree in the 4 years, and for me, it was a really great experience because it does what a liberal arts school should do. It opened your mind to and opened me to a lot of experiences, a lots of different ways of thinking, a way to be a critical thinker. It allowed me to meet to some extent different people, but the university, well, I keep saying university because now it's Marian University. It was college when I was there. But the school is still pretty homogenous. There's a little bit of diversity, but it's not what I would consider a diverse school quite really in my experience. But for me, the biggest difference or the biggest diversity was the religion for me. Like that was something new for me to experience. And I took it kind of like an interest in like a curiosity sort of way. I didn't think that I ever have to become Catholic. There was never any like feeling that I'd have to convert, but I did have to take theology courses as part of my general education, which I wasn't resistant to. It was fine. And then being on the college track and field team was really meaningful to me, and I got to have part of my schooling paid for that, so that was great. So I got my art degree in 4 years, and I graduated in 2002. But I went back to Marian College 7 years later to get a sociology degree. So I went to Marian College twice. And my second time there, it was just 2 semesters for me to get my sociology degree. So when I went to Marian College, it was both for my fine art degree my sociology degree 7 years later. And both times it still had that liberal arts feel, people encouraging you to be a critical thinker. But it also kind of started my concern with social justice as well. So I think deep into my core, that was the biggest shift, is being aware of like social justice issues when I was there.
And I'm curious, when did you graduate from Marian College?
Sure. So the first time was 2002, and the second time I was there for fall and spring of 2008, 2009 for the 2 semesters.
Wonderful. And I'm curious, I know it was going to a Catholic affiliated institution. I'm curious, what information did you receive about sexuality and the LGBTQ community as part? I know you said you took theology courses as part of your general education. What information did you receive?
Nothing from the school, nothing from the courses. There were like, it's interesting because a lot of the people who went to Marian College came from the Oldenburg Academy and Batesville High School. So in southeastern Indiana, the Sisters of Oldenburg, or Sisters of St. Francis and Oldenburg, are the kind of parent organization, so to speak, of Marian College. So a lot of the students who came from that part of Indiana went to Marian for their college education. So like there was no real overt, explicit conversation about sexuality. But college kids, once they're in the same space, they eventually fall into sexual experiences and become active. And there were a lot of the college kids, particularly the girls, who I think they might have been wrestling with their own sexuality in a lot of ways, but I can't presume that. But there were college girls that I did have sexual relations with because they were interested in me as a non-Catholic person, I guess. I don't really know. But it wasn't until college that I ever encountered any person in my same-sex relations. And they were Catholic girls who where you could tell that they did not know how to understand. They enjoyed being my partner, but then they didn't know how to reconcile that. And so those relationships never went for more than like a few months before they would withdraw for whatever reasons they had. And I just kind of didn't have any feelings about that. I was like, okay. And that was, again, because I didn't have much of a base of relationships in my growing up. It just kind of like, oh, okay, well, this has come to an end and that's what it is. And then the next one would come and leave, and that would be fine. And it was interesting because I didn't have any. That was like a brief period in college, the only time that I had those relationships. And then throughout my 20s, I didn't have any relationships again either, just because I guess in the back of my head, Grandpa's like, "Don't get pregnant." So, so I didn't really continue to seek out relationships. I didn't date. I didn't just look for anything. Um, because I think really what I was looking for again is like those platonic, strong friend relationships. Those tend to always be a higher priority for my own satisfaction in a lot of ways.
Most definitely. And I know you mentioned that the students that you had relationships with, they themselves were struggling with their identity. Did they use any specific language to identify themselves personally?
No, because the two that I was most involved with, I would say they're both now married to men, and one of them in particular, and I don't have any connection with them. Like after we graduated, we didn't have any connections. But one of them, she was the oldest of six, and after school, she got married, and she I think has 3 or 4 kids now. So she's kind of living what she knew. And then the other one I just learned, I think got married just last year, but I think they both present as straight, but I don't know if they just suppress what their experiences were. I'm not really sure, but they both present very straight right now.
Yes. And going along with that, I was curious, did you attend any post-secondary education outside of your college experience at Marian College and then university?
Sure. Yes. So when I graduated with my sociology degree from Marian College in 2009, I took a year off, and then I attended Ball State University for my master's in sociology, and I was there from 2010 to my graduating in 2012. And then I attended Penn State University for a PhD program. I was enrolled in the rural sociology program with a concentration of sociology of food and agriculture. But I left the program after 1 year, both due to health reasons, and I didn't think it was a good fit. And Happy Valley isn't Happy Valley. um, I wasn't completely satisfied there. Something just didn't feel right. And then so yeah, I have my master's degree and then 1 year of doctoral studies.
Wonderful. And I'm curious, going along with that, while you were attending Ball State, how did you experience the Muncie LGBTQ community? Did you feel a part of it?
No, and I think part of that is because I didn't live in Muncie except one of the 4 semesters that I was a student. So the first semester of my first year, I was commuting from Bloomington. So that was a long commute. I had signed a lease before I was admitted to the program, and it took a while before I could find a subletter. So that first semester, I commuted, and that was challenging. The second semester of that year, um, I uh, I lived in. Did I? Yes, I lived in Muncie, and that wasn't so much as being a part of the Muncie community as much as I started to engage a little bit more with my cohort. So we would go get drinks, and that would be like down at the silo or at docks in downtown. And then sometimes we'd go to the Mark III, but it wasn't like, hey, we're a bunch of queer kids going to the Mark. It was like, oh, there's another place to drink. But then I was told that it was a gay bar, which was kind of fun, and we'd go to drag shows. But it wasn't, again, like one of those things that um, was like a very intentional process, and it certainly wasn't intentional with regard to my own identity. Um, and then my second year at Ball State, I lived in Fishers and I commuted. Much better commute than Bloomington, I'll say. But I was partnered at the time with a woman, and it was not a healthy relationship. So I certainly didn't really communicate and dig into the Muncie community because I was still finishing my degree. I was not in a healthy relationship, and there just wasn't much time for in between any of those things. So I would say that my Ball State experience in Muncie when I was in grad school, I didn't have a strong connection to the community, but it wasn't for a lack of, community resources or people. It was just the situation I was
Most definitely. And I was curious, I know you mentioned that you went to the Mark III tap room and didn't initially know that it was a gay bar. How did you first learn about the Mark III?
in. Yeah, it was one of those things. It was just like, we would kind of go from one spot to the other, and we went in, and it was a gay bar, and it was like, oh, this is cool. And I think um, I know. I was trying to think of whether or not it was my first gay bar experience. I might have been to Talbot Street in Indianapolis before that. Um, it would have been really in my early part of my gay bar experiences. I also didn't consume alcohol until I was 27, and again, it wasn't an intentional thing of like I didn't have any value ascribed to it. I just didn't want to, and I didn't care to, and but it wasn't until I was 27 that I even really go to bars anyway, just because I didn't really want that experience. And I think I might have been to Talbot Street before that, but it was one of the two, and it was like in my late 20s when it happened. But well, I guess when I was at Ball State, I was 30. But the it was like we're there, and it was a gay bar. It wasn't like let's go to a gay bar. So, but once we were there, it was a lot of fun, and then it was in their old location on Main Street, and it was like a cool. It felt like a hole in the wall kind of feel. It was just like a dive bar kind of feel, but like I felt like I could tell that everybody there knew each other. Like there was strong community there, and So you kind of felt not like an outsider in a bad way, but it was, as a sociologist, it was great. I'm like watching people. So it was great for watching people and watching the community. You could tell people were there to like celebrate the weekend and just be done with work for the day, and they're catching up with friends. And the times that I would go there for like it being a drag show, that was always a lot of fun too. You could tell people were really into it. But yeah, it was like I didn't know it was a gay bar until I was there, and it wasn't something like let's go to the gay bar. Let's go to the bar that happens to be a gay bar.
And I'm curious, I know you mentioned that you and your friends had also attended drag shows. Would you mind sharing more about that experience?
I mean, I'm kind of like um I could kind of consider myself a little boisterous. Like I get pretty excited when there's things going on. So like I'm always cheering people on and throwing money and having a good time and singing karaoke along with it. And so I would just have a fun time. But I think like drag to me, I I don't have like any strong feelings for it or against it. I like being entertained by it. And I think I'm probably more critical of it now than I was when I was going to the mark the first time. And critical meaning like I think about it more. Um, when I was at the mark and when I was in grad school, it was more of like a passive, hey, like let's tip these, performers and let's get another round of shots and oh, they're playing this song and look at these lights and how did they do the splits in those heels? And it was like just a lot of like passive audience kind of participation, except I am very loud and I'll scream and cheer and what have you. But yeah, I mean, it was just fun being entertained and you could tell that they were talented and it just was like I think I did probably fuse in my mind that gay bars are where drag is done. So like I think that's part of what I understood a gay bar to be is, oh, there's going to be drag shows. But there's obviously times that you can go to a gay bar and there's not drag shows. So, but I think my early experiences with that were, I would go to the bar and it happened to be a gay bar and it happened to be a night that there was a drag show. But, oh, I'm going to have fun now that I'm here. So, yeah, I think in a lot of times in my early stages of engaging in queer spaces, it was a lot of times more passive than intentional.
Yes, and I was curious, I know that you were involved with Ball State University. Were you involved in any student organizations like Spectrum on campus?
No, and I think again that might have been part of my three semesters of commuting versus not. I don't know that I was aware of them either, and I don't know if part of that is because I was a grad student as well. I think there is now more intentionality in reaching out to grad students for organizations, but I don't know that I felt that when I was in school the first time.
Yes. And I was curious going along with that. I know you mentioned that you went to Penn University for that PhD program. What brought you back to Muncie?
Oh, we're gonna we're gonna go on a journey before I come back to Muncie. So um, when I went to Penn State, I made a lot of friends there. They were great, and I'm still in touch with some of them. And then on my spring break at Penn State, I decided to rent a car. I didn't have a car when I was there. I decided to rent a car and drive to Austin, Texas for my spring break by myself. Why not? And I spent a week in Austin, and I was like, this is a place I could probably live, and not realizing how much it would cost to live there and whatever else. um, but when I decided to drop out of the program at Penn State, um, I made my move to Austin in July, which I don't recommend. It's hot. Don't move to Texas when it's hot. And then I was in a relationship there with a woman who was about 10 or 11 years older than me. And it started off like a fine relationship, but it didn't go particularly well. And I lived in Austin from the summer of, again, summer of 2013 until May of 2015. And when I moved from Austin, I moved back to Fishers. And Fishers is kind of where I felt like I grew up as an adult. It was where I basically lived in my 20s because that's where my work was. So when I moved back home, it was in Fishers. Um, Paula and Bob, Keelan's mom and stepdad, they live in like the Castleton area, so it was kind of like moving home because I had that family relationship there as well. Um, and then when I moved back to Indiana, my girlfriend at the time moved with me, but then when we broke up, she moved back to Austin. And so that was May of 2015. And then I ran into Sherry, who is my wife, that summer. And then she moved to Minneapolis in October. And I had broken up with my ex in September, but I was already in that stage of how am I going to get unwind this relationship. Um, and I actually fell in love with Sherry really early. And when she moved to Minneapolis, it was kind of tough on me, but I knew it would work. Um, and then my ex moved back to Texas, which is not how I thought I would be with a song. Like my ex lives in Texas, but whatever. Um, that all happened. Like Sherry moving to Minneapolis and my ex moving to Texas was like all within a couple of weeks of each other. So it was a lot of like tumultuous things happening at once. Um, but I decided that I really wanted to pursue a relationship with Sherry. So we were long distance for a little while. And I moved to Minneapolis in January of 2016. So you can see already how I do it wrong. I moved to Austin in the summertime and Minneapolis in the wintertime. And don't do that. Sherry and I lived in Minneapolis until October of 2016, and we moved to Muncie in December of 16. So the month of November was a gap between our lease ending in Minneapolis and when our lease would start in Muncie. So we traveled the country for a month. And then so moving back to Muncie took a long while before I actually got back in Muncie. So Sherry and I got married in December of 15. We've lived in Muncie since December of 16. Ever since then, we've been here
Wonderful. And I'm curious, where did you get married?
in Indianapolis. So 2015 was kind of a year for our community in a lot of ways. And in Indiana in particular, that was when Mike Pence tried to pass the RFRA. And then it went through its watering down, but he certainly made clear what he wanted for our community to be very easily discriminated against in the name of religious freedom. And so we decided, Sherry and I, that it would be wonderful to get married outside on Monument Circle and make a one-fingered gesture in the air while we did that. And we wanted to get married in some place that was kind of felt a little bit more like really our life and our identities are pretty politicized, and we thought we'd make that as public as we could. It was small. It was just one of my childhood friends who was our she presided over our marriage, and she's ordained. And then I had two friends, and Sherry had two of her three sisters there. And we got married, and we walked and had beer and pizza at Basbo's, and that was our reception. And I mean, we were married, so that was it. But we did think it was funny because when we filed for our marriage certificate, it was in Hamilton County, because I was living in Fishers still. And the county clerk has to ask questions for the certification. And they asked if we were blood relatives, and I'm like, yeah, no. And even if we were, what's it going to really do? So, so I mean, she kind of looked at us and she was like, this is going to sound silly, but I have to ask this. And I was like, yeah, it's going to sound really silly. But it was funny though, because I mean, she was otherwise very happy for our marriage. Like she didn't really have any, she certainly wasn't Kim Davis in Kentucky, like really against us having our certificate. And so, I mean, it was kind of neat. So we had our marriage or our wedding in Indianapolis downtown, and then we got our certificate in Hamilton County, and we're on 5 years and change now, so we're still going.
That's really exciting. And going along with that, that leads right into my next question. How do you personally identify?
Sure. And I think that's something that's changed in the last maybe year or so too, maybe a little bit more. The main thing I will always say is I'm queer. I believe in the word queer a lot. Um, I believe in it in so many different ways. I would never put that word on somebody if they don't believe in it or if they don't feel right with it. So I won't say, well, you're just queer. I would never do that. Um, but I identify as a bisexual woman, but I also feel really strong with the label of demisexual as well. But I don't go into those particular labels until a second round of questioning is asked, because the main thing I want to say is that I am queer. Because I do think it's important for me to understand my own identity and know how I'm going to navigate the world and see the world. So the terms bisexual and demisexual matter to me a little bit. But in terms of how do I fit in society, I just want to stick with the word queer, because I think the more we split up our otherness, we're fighting for scraps. And I think the more we can unite in our otherness, it's better. But I know that there's historically some parts of our community that don't want to identify with the word queer, either because it hurt them in the past or they want to be a little bit separate from the rest of the community. And so I know the word is not really going to ever get universal appeal, but for me, it's just what works.
Thank you. And going along with that, and this leads into the next question. Have you always identified this way? And have you ever identified in different identities or in different terminology?
Sure, I would say, I never, I'll tell you a little story. I was just telling Sherry this not long ago. Whenever I was a kid, I always pictured myself being a housewife, but I never pictured the spouse. Like I never had any idea who the spouse would be. And it's funny because I never really had any childhood images of marriages. My mom wasn't married, my aunt wasn't married. My uncle was married, but he was distant and I didn't really think much of it. My grandparents got divorced. My great grandpa is a widower and my great grandma is a widow. And so it's like I never really saw marriage. You see it on TV, your friends are got parents that are married, but like I never really knew what it meant to see like how marriages work in like both the positive and the negative way. But I always pictured, oh yeah, I'm gonna be like a teacher. I'm gonna be a housewife, which I don't know how those reconciled as a kid. I didn't figure that out. But I always pictured maybe I would have kids, maybe I wouldn't, until I realized later on I didn't want to have kids. I knew that a little bit more certainly later on. But I always pictured that I would be married and I just had no idea who the spouse was. So I think part of me always knew that the gender of my spouse never really factored into it. So I think that helps me understand that I probably always was bi, but I also really know that I never prioritized sexuality in my connections with people. So I think that demisexuality probably was always there too. Um, but did I know those words? No, I didn't know those words well into later in life. But I also, so it's kind of like my childhood, right? Like I didn't know, but I knew. I knew without the language. And then, but I didn't think that made me different than other people. Except I think that asexuality made me feel a little bit more different because I didn't try to like find people to date, and I didn't try to like um experiment with sexuality at any point, and that was nothing that I really wanted to do. So I think that made me feel more different than whether or not I would want to do that with a woman versus a man or anything like that. And then in my 20s again, I was still pretty ace. And then whenever I was in my 30s, um, I also am very attracted to people who are attracted to me, which is not great necessarily like standards, but like so if anybody ever showed interest in me, I would take interest in that interest. So if it was a woman that did or a man that did, that wouldn't be a thing that would factor in. And if somebody had their own questioning of their own gender, that wouldn't affect me either. Because it's always the relationship that mattered to me more than who the relationship was with. Um, but I don't think I really stuck to any labels until probably, in well into my 30s. And at that point, I realized, yeah, I am bisexual. And it wasn't until, like I say, maybe in the last year that I realized demisexual might explain a little bit more about what my life was like. So I think those terms really fit for quite a while. The word queer probably didn't really fit with me until probably planning the business, honestly. Um, like I think I always said the word bisexual before that, or bi, but then understanding the power and the rhyming factor of queer chocolatier. I think the word queer didn't hit me until I really kind of started thinking about it a lot more intentionally. And I'm glad I did, because that's where I've settled on.
Most definitely. And I'm curious, going along with that, how do you identify in the Muncie LGBTQ community? Have you found any shared spaces in that community that you personally share and identify in?
Yes and no. I think I fit. mm, I feel like I'm in a weird intersection, and I'm also outside. So it's kind of weird. I think where I'm at an intersection is I am older than a lot of younger queer people who may more easily and readily pick up the word queer. They may also know more about labels themselves. Um, and they also may be a little bit more understanding of gender identity, as well as sexual orientation, particularly the gray sexualities, because a lot of that I did learn from people younger than me. And then I'm also younger than our elder queer population, and elder queers, not necessarily saying that they're in their 60s or older, but just people who are older than me, who have a little bit more of a shared memory across the generations of what it was like to be gay. And I think I occupy a space in that time where um, I'm at that transition of slightly more acceptance versus what they experienced when there wasn't really much acceptance. So I sit kind of weirdly at that intersection, but I also feel kind of outside because I don't I'm not plugged into a lot of what the existing community that is here. I would say Muncie has kind of like a homegrown queer community for people who are from Muncie. Um, and then if they weren't from Muncie, maybe they came to Muncie from one of the surrounding counties and smaller towns, and they settled into Muncie. So I don't really have a strong connection with that population of folks because I'm not from here. But I think I've built my own queer community through my business. And I think that's where I feel most connected to the queer community in Muncie, is through either, excuse me, those folk being customers or supporters of our business, or me as representing my business going elsewhere into the community. And also just being a small business owner kind of makes it hard to make time for community. So that is kind of tough. But I think where I fit is kind of both and. Sometimes I'm a part of it and sometimes I'm not a part of it. And I can't always tell if it's because I'm not plugging in or if they're not welcoming. I can't really sometimes tell that. But I do think I have a good community here because of the business primarily.
And I'm curious, I know you bring up Queer Chocolatier. What sparked the development of Queer Chocolatier?
So I've made truffles and chocolates since about 2004. And now that you know a little bit more about my upbringing, I didn't really grow up with a lot of cooking from scratch at home. That wasn't really anything that was. I'm not testing out recipes that I had from kids, right? Like since my childhood or anything. There's not really a lot of that influenced me. But when I first made my truffles, it was just by chance when I did, and but it sparked something in me to think, oh, well, this can be kind of like a creative outlet. So I graduated with my art degree in 2002, and a couple years later is when I'm making my first batch of truffles, and I'm like, I could add a bunch of flavors to this. I could do this, and it just became like this fun experimentation. Um, and so I rewired my thinking of like, oh, I can have my creative outlets through food now. And I did that for years and years and years. And in 2004, I started my first career, and I was a stockbroker for a number of years. And I would bring a lot of my truffles, or sometimes I would think, oh, well, if this flavor is good in a truffle, I bet it'd be good in a cheesecake. And so I would start making other desserts, and I just kind of got caught up into doing that. And then it made me ask more questions about food. And then I got really curious about the social justice parts of food. So it really just kind of rippled out. Um, and when I'd bring my food to work, people would be like, oh, this is great. And then like weeks later, they'd complain about gaining weight or whatever. I'm like, shut up, just have this truffle. Tell me what you think. And so I'd use a lot of like guinea pigs at work, right? And then when I came to grad school, Sherry was in my cohort. So I went to school with Sherry. And I would bring food to grad school and have professors and students eat my food. And then Sherry and I got married years later. And when we were living in Minneapolis, I was making a little bit of truffles here and there too, but I didn't make a lot of friends in Minneapolis. But I had a couple. And so I'd make some, but like a batch of truffles is like 2 dozen truffles, and you hand them out to 4 friends and you have still a lot of truffles. And Sherry's like, okay, you're going to have to make a business. You can no longer give these away for free. I'm like, yeah, but, and she's like, no, you need to make a business. This has value. You're really good at what you do. And I'm like, yeah, but I just like doing this. And she's like, you're not allowed to make truffles again until you're selling them in a business. And I was like,
Oh.
I was like so demoralized. I'm like, fine, like Google, how do I start a business? And I just started like digging in and figuring it out. And like for a while I thought about like what kind of food business would I maybe want to do. And it's kind of easy to like have a dream that's out here somewhere, and it's not specific, and it's just this general vague dream. And so long as you have that dream out here, then it's something to think about. And like I thought, oh, maybe I'd have a dessert restaurant, or oh, maybe I'll have a food truck, or oh, maybe I'll do a barbecue shop, because I lived in Texas and I loved the barbecue when I was there. And oh, maybe I would do, oh, maybes, right? Like all these thoughts. Well, then Sherry's like, okay, well, if you like doing chocolate and you like, you want to have a restaurant, like just make us work, make us be your starting point. Start small, she said. And I think we took it too literally because truffles are small. But I mean, to go through all the work of having a business, I mean, this ain't small. Like this has been a lot of work. So she was like, if you really want to try doing a business, let's move back to Muncie, where the cost of living is going to be more affordable for us. And let's do like, we'll just kind of experiment with like our community resources there. We'll know people, it'll work out. And I'm like, okay, cool. And in 2016, and when we moved back, I actually went back to the place that I was a stockbroker before, and I started that work again. But I was only there for like 3 months and a day, because a friend of mine got like a 3-month signing bonus if I lasted for 3 months. So I stayed an extra day to make sure she'd get paid. But anyway, after I quit there again, I think that would have been in the month of May. I spent the entire month of June really digging into how do I file an LLC? How do I get my tax identification number? How do I start to open a bank account? How do I test recipes? What do I do for shipping? And I started really digging in, and I was like, okay, I need to make a website now. At some point though, early on in that conversation, I thought, what am I going to call this place? And then I remember standing in my living room by myself, and then I laughed because I'm an only child and I'm okay laughing by myself. But I said, what if I called it Queer Chocolatier? And I just kind of like that, like that's all I kind of was like, yeah, I could do that. And then I told Sherry, and I was like, what if I call my business Queer Chocolatier? And she was fine. Like she didn't say yes or no. She was just kind of like, oh, whatever. And I was like, what if I did this? And then, but then it made me really pause and think, well, if I did this in Muncie, what's going to happen? So I started to kind of worry a little bit. But then I thought, what if I leaned into this really, really hard? And I did. I guess I did. And I think what I was worried about most never came to fruition. Like, I think I worried about the worst case scenarios, and I never anticipated all the good things that have come from it. Um, and I think I'm glad that I listened to those really silly instincts of mine. Because if I had opened, Morgan's Chocolates or whatever, like, I mean, my chocolate's good. I mean, I still have the best chocolate in town, and that's all. I still believe in my product, and I'm still the same person and gregarious and welcoming and all of this. And people would have known that I was queer whenever they would meet my wife Sherry, who's standing at my side or what have you. And but I think calling myself Queer Chocolatier made it so much more intentional and so much more transparent, and it gave me then, like, putting it out there then gave me the confidence to be more outwardly queer. And I think what it did was kind of start this domino effect of like, okay, now I'm called Queer Chocolatier, so now I'm going to have to be ready for a lot of questions and conversation about queerness. And doing that means I'm going to have to learn more about my own queerness in society. And doing that's going to make me more comfortable to have these conversations. So it just kind of kept leading into itself. But then, like, we learned more about ourselves of like, oh, well, I don't have alcohol in my space. That's different than most queer spaces. What does that really mean? And then we kind of dug into that a lot more and understanding what queer sober spaces mean. And then looking around the entire country, there's a lot of queer sober businesses that are starting. There's a lot of like, one of my friends now is a Black queer woman in Louisville who is starting a tea business. And that would have only come into my field of vision after having been Queer Chocolatier. So it's like a lot of this had its own momentum that continued to build, which in some ways feels like validating. Like, I don't know if I would have had this much momentum if it hadn't been for the right reasons, I guess. Or at least I tell myself that, and I guess that's comforting. So but I think the evolution of it, just at the very beginning, was really knowing that my wife saw value in what I did as far as being a maker, and then me taking the risk of being very transparent with who I am after that.
Wonderful. And I was curious, what year was your business founded in?
Yeah. So I am technically the founding and the filing of my business was in July of 2017, and then I opened for business in August of 2017.
Wonderful. And I know you brought up this idea about sober queer spaces. And I was wondering, what is the importance of having these spaces in Muncie?
I think the value is incalculable. I think it really is very important. Whether it's my continued space or a space that comes after me or comes concurrently, like, there can only be more queer sober spaces so far as I'm concerned. I think the importance sits kind of in three factors. I think it provides an alternative. That's really the main thing. It provides an alternative and a new vision of what queer spaces can be like. I think the importance of having queer spaces also allows for people of all ages to engage in a queer space, where queer bars, immediately, if you're under 21, you can't access that community. So where do queer folk who are younger than 21 go to engage in community in a third space? It's limited. They can make their own space. They can go to a coffee shop and meet together and have that community, but it's not purposefully queer at that point. So whenever, young kids from like the academy would come to Queer Chocolatier, you can tell that they now had a space they could call theirs. And it being queer, and they can be fully authentic, and they don't have to worry about being a certain age to be able to get in, because they could come in, whenever they wanted to. So I think as younger and younger come into their own identities and understand themselves more, they need to build on their community. And I think having that community in person versus just purely on the internet too has some sort of extra resonance to it. So, you have queer youth that need sober spaces just because of the access point. But I mean, historically speaking, our community has some substance use and abuse and dependence throughout the ages. And some folks don't want to be tempted by it. They may be older than 21. And they may not be in a position where they feel comfortable anymore about being around alcohol or any other illicit substances that might be in bars. So they don't want to be present in those spaces. So where do they go if they decide not to enter that space? And then folks who maybe use alcohol, but they're not dependent upon it. They just want something different. Maybe they don't want a loud drag show filled space. And it's like on Netflix, Hannah Gatsby, on her first series called Nanette, she says, where do the quiet gays go? And I'm like, well, they can kind of hang out at Queer Chocolatier now, even though I'm not particularly quiet myself. But like, we kind of have that coffee shop sort of feel where it's kind of quiet and chill, but there'll be cross conversation across the room, and that isn't always quiet, but it's not, dance music, and it's not flashing lights and what have you. So I think it's just another alternative, and I think the more alternatives that we can have for our community, the better. And I think the ability to have that community built without the help or influence or harm that alcohol provides can make a more authentic community in some cases. I mean, it may be dangerous to say the word authentic in that case, but at least there's not any sort of mitigating factor that allows people to engage. Maybe people are, feel more emboldened by having a little bit of alcohol and feel a little bit more free to engage with people, but they don't have to have that in my space. So, but yeah, I think that queer sober space it's important in Muncie just to have, more visibility, more again, alternatives. But I think you're going to see more queer spaces emerge throughout the country. The only question is, how much will the pandemic slow that down? Probably for the rest of the community, like other communities around the country. So yeah, I mean, the other part of it though too is like alcohol is a big money ticket item, so it's going to be hard for people to really afford a business that is queer and sober. So that's going to be kind of challenging for people to navigate. But in Muncie, for the most part, things are pretty affordable to run a business. I can't say broadly that's the case, but in some cases it's affordable. So I think it's a little bit easier for me to have this particular business here in Muncie versus Indianapolis or Minneapolis or Austin, where there might be more queer people, but the cost of doing business would be so much higher too. So
That's wonderful. And I know your space has brought wonderful opportunities for many more people in the community. So it's very, very wonderful to have you here.
thank you. I appreciate that.
And I was curious, going along with that, what impact have you seen your business having on the Muncie LGBTQ community?
I hate this question. I hate it so much. I hate it so much. My phone helps me with it. It says I have 15% battery, so I may try and start this question, and then I may pause to go get my battery connector. But it's hard for me to know. I am at the middle of this, and I am always in the weeds of like, oh, what do I need to do today to keep the business going? And I can only do my best to answer it. But I think it's just, again, I've taken up space for people to know that there's the potential for a queer business to exist in Muncie and be unapologetic about it. I've made a lot of friends through the business, and that matters to me. I hope it matters to them too. I'm just hopeful. I really don't know, but I can hope that it matters to people, and I hope people like me and my chocolate, and I really don't know.
And I'm curious, I might reframe that. What impact do you hope to have in the future? I know you just mentioned you have some exciting news that are coming for your business. So I was curious how you're expanding and how that'll look in the future.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hoping to do in the future is I think it's just going to be really cool to have two queer businesses on Walnut Street in downtown Muncie, right? Like the, we're that's per like 2 blocks of downtown, like that's a pretty high ratio of queer businesses now in Muncie, right? And I think there's something that can be really positively spun with that if the right people want to tell that story. Now, I don't know if, with the current makeup of our local government, if that's a story they want to tell. That's up to them to suss out themselves. But I think there is something to be said for Indiana's oldest gay bar in Muncie, being located in Muncie, and then a pretty cool queer sober space that sells pretty great chocolate just at the other end of that strip, right? And I think that's really cool. So I think that means something for me for the future. But like when I think about the business, I think there's two things. There's the chocolate side, and then there's the queer side. And like I'm still really always thinking about the chocolate side. How do I need to make this work so that this can happen, right? But I've also been taught that this is what makes this possible. Um, the queer community steps in and helps me out and supports me in so many ways that if I didn't have them to uplift me, then I wouldn't have a chance to continue what I'm doing. But as I continue to kind of develop I'm going to try and make like a little small factory for chocolate production. But I'm hoping that that space, since it is quite large, I can make for more community access once the pandemic is more mitigated. Like I would love for there to be like J.R. Jameson to read like some of his book from Hillbilly Queer once he has that fully published. Maybe he can do a reading at Queer Chocolatier. Maybe there can be some GSAs who want to meet at Queer Chocolatier and have chocolate. Maybe there's open mic nights and art nights and movie nights and all that kind of stuff that can really make a queer space really vibrant. And again, without the concept of alcohol being a part of it. But I'm hoping that for the future, it can just be a space that people make it become. Like, I really want people to make that front of house be as vibrant as they want it to be. Because I do want it to feel more like a home, as homey as a third space in our society can be. I really want that to be the case. So those are my future goals. Plus, again, selling chocolate.
And I know you mentioned creating spaces for LGBTQ young people. And I know in Muncie, we have Muncie Outreach, which provides some of those spaces. Have you been involved in the organization?
Not directly. I have a relationship with Laura, so I'm able to communicate with her a fair bit. I have friends that volunteer with Muncie Outreach, and they do great work. I think when you think of now downtown Muncie, you're going to have these three organizations, right? The Mark III, Muncie Outreach, and Queer Chocolatier. And I think we each three have a very different way of serving our communities, and I think that's pretty great. Oh, can I put you on pause because my phone will die?
Yes, no, feel free, go ahead.
Type.
Just another moment of posterity of how queer folk can sometimes be disorganized.
Well, thank you so much for offering to continue on with the interview. I was curious going along with that. I know you were discussing Muncie outreach. I know that this year, I believe there was a Muncie Pride event that was going to be in development. Would you mind sharing more? Were you involved in this event?
Um, so I was, and then I withdrew my participation. And um, I feel comfortable speaking my truth about it. But I also want to. I'm always careful about speaking too much about it. I know this is for a project, so it's different. But I don't want what I say to make it seem as though I don't want there to be a Muncie Pride. So with that kind of caveat out there, I'm still kind of critical of what took place, to the point where I again went ahead and withdrew my support, but withdrew my personal support. Like I wasn't any longer part of the planning. But yeah, whenever we first started having conversations about whether there was going to be a Muncie Pride, the first initial conversations said that our mission or our goal for a Muncie Pride would be to uplift and center the multi-marginalized members of our community. And then there were conversations during the planning where some folks who early on wanted Muncie Pride to look a lot like Indy Pride or Chicago Pride or something else that seemed a lot more expensive and flashy, and something that was already indicative of like being well resourced and already well planned and a strong infrastructure in place. And I think the expectations some of those folks had early on, of what they wanted versus what was possible, I think those were not in alignment. And after a while, it was like me and another woman were the most vocal, and I being second to her. She was much more focused on really reiterating that we all agreed that Muncie Pride was going to be about uplifting and centering the multi-margin members of our community. Like we kept kind of reiterating what our stated goals were and how what some people were wanting to have did not meet that goal. So that became kind of like a little bit of a tension point, I think, at some junctures. And so some people they also stepped away from their planning and their contributions because they wanted a lot more of like the floats and the kind of focusing on the cis gay men kind of perspective of it versus most prides are already catered to that audience. Couldn't there be a little bit more of an effort to make something more reflective of Muncie, but also not only the cis gay men? So that just kind of had like some early tension, and it kind of sorted itself out. Like again, some of those folks stepped away from planning. But then when the pandemic hit, there was a second wrinkle in that, and now we're becoming virtual. And some people did not want to do a virtual event, and I can understand not wanting to do a virtual event, but not because they would prefer to do one in person. Like it was not possible to do a in-person event during a pandemic. Like that's clearly not something that we needed to do. So to me, in some regard, I think it might have been healthier just to continue to extend the planning to when we could do a in-person event, but the continuation of planning a virtual event is what took place. But whenever I learned that they were expecting some folks to give labor for free where they were paying other people, I could see where they were paying people who were a little bit more I don't know, privileged in some ways, but then they were expecting people who were multiply marched to be giving their labor for free. And I took some pretty strong umbrage with that. And I said my piece during the meeting, and then I followed up that meeting the next day by saying that I think maybe I'm not the best person to continue in the planning process, and I separated myself. So I was part of the planning from like almost at the beginning. I think I might have not been at the first meeting, but I was at meetings after, up until I was probably maybe about a year of the process, but not I wasn't at the very end of the process.
what I was happy to do is the planning events took place both at Outreach and at Queer Chocolatier, and we kind of rotated the days of the week that we would meet at each place. So like on even months, it would be a Wednesday night at Outreach, and then on odd months, it would be a Sunday afternoon at Queer Chocolatier. So I was happy to again offer up my space for the planning, and then obviously with the pandemic, we stopped doing that. But beyond offering my planning space and what have you, I decided then that I couldn't really fit with the direction of things were going, and decided to remove my presence from the planning. I didn't want to get in their way, but I also didn't want to continue to put my weight where I didn't believe it either.
Yes, yes. And I know throughout the interviews, we've heard other experiences from interviewees who also moved away from the event a little bit. I was curious, going along with it as well, what do you see in the future for Muncie Pride events? I know this would have been, I believe, one of the first ones to occur in Muncie. Do you believe that there are futures in Pride events in Muncie, and what would that look like?
So I think from what I understand, there's planning already, kind of discussion going on about a future one. But what I've heard third hand is that instead of having a big pride as like monthly events taking place to kind of lead up to something that might be a full-on pride. I think a community pride is perfectly fine for communities. I think they can be fun events. My personal take on pride is kind of complicated. Like I do believe that there is a purpose for visibility. I do think there's a purpose for people coming together and celebrating themselves. I don't think that it needs to be particularly sponsored by corporations. I don't think it needs to be all about like throwing money at entertainment when there's a lot of material conditions of our community that need to be met. So I think sometimes I'm like, I'll go to a pride and then I'll be like, oh, this was kind of fun. But like at the same time, it's like, I could have just had a cup of tea at home and would have been just as good. And also, I think that, the money could go to other things. And so I think I'm just at this place where I'm not 100% super in love with pride as a concept anymore, because it does feel it kind of feels to me perfunctory at this point. It feels like there's pride because we're supposed to have it, rather than what is it actually doing, and how can we be a little bit more inward and introspective of what is it that it's supposed to do. And like, there's obviously society is not super fully accepting queer communities, and I get that. So long as there's like this resistance, we should still be visible. But I don't really need, to see, corporations paying for that visibility, because then, what's that? I mean, are those corporations really taking care of their queer business or queer employees? I'd rather see a little bit, I don't know. It's like there's still this like pride does two things and it doesn't do either of them fully. It's like they're trying to say, hey, we're queer and we belong, but they're also trying to say, but we're just like you and we're family friendly and we're normal. And I think neither of those are really what needs to happen in a parade format and in a party format. Like I kind of struggle with it because I think it's a complicated concept, and I don't know how well that fits in Muncie. I don't know how well it fits in general. Like to me, I think like most pride events can just kind of wear down at some point, and I don't know if it's like outgrown its purpose, but I don't know that it's accomplishing any concrete goals either. So
I completely understand that. And
yeah,
I,
talking, and I don't know if I'm saying the right things or not, but I'm hopefully getting it out.
yes, and going along with that, I think this might provide a good platform as well. If you could have your ideal pride, what would that look like, and how would it affect the community?
it wouldn't be a pride.
I think I am more concerned with um, the material conditions of queer people. Like our homeless population is overrepresented, or like I should say it this way, our community is overrepresented in the homeless population. We also have a lot of challenges with healthcare. We also have a lot of challenges with workplace discrimination. We have a lot of challenges with, accessing good housing and maintaining it when we do. Um, we we have a lot of material situations that need to be addressed. But I know it's not either or. I know that we can celebrate who we are while pursuing those things, but I don't want to detract um, from meeting a lot of those material conditions. I think for me, what would be like more pride would be, less cops at our events. It would be more political resistance and activization and mobilization, and it would be engaging in stronger mutual aid relationships. It would be, how do we get more businesses that are queer? How do we um, get more opportunities to collaborate with, the Black community and the uh, undocumented immigrant community? And how do we, again, kind of make some significant changes rather than just wallpapering and saying, hey, it gets better, and absolute vodka floats going down the street. Like none of that really matters to me as much as what are we really going to do to put boots on the ground and change in policies and laws and companies and all of this. Like all of that is just much more salient to me than just spending a hot day in an Indiana summer outside with, music I probably don't even know who's playing in the band. I don't know. So like some of that just doesn't matter to me. But an ideal pride would be much more focused on changing our day-to-day lives so that we can be proud and that we can live. I mean, those things matter to me more than the others.
Most definitely. Most definitely. And going along with that, I was really excited to ask. I know that you have been in the community for a period of time and established a business here. How have you seen the visibility of the LGBTQ community change over time?
It's funny because it's like, I don't know how much of it is you buy a red car and now you see red cars everywhere. So it's like, I'm not sure how much I am like seeing what I want to see. Um, but during the pandemic, part of my business has shifted to where I'm delivering to people because I don't want people to come into the space, and I don't want people to get sick, and I don't want to get sick. So delivery has been a safe way to do that. Safe but exhausting, but that's beside the point. But I mean, I see a lot more pride flags in people's houses and apartments. And I don't know how much that happened before. And then I think I see, especially in the village and especially before the pandemic, I would see people walking to and from my shop holding hands where I don't know how likely they would have in other places. Um, I see, uh, I see other businesses stepping up in solidarity as well. And I know that it's common wisdom for businesses is to be apolitical. And I think that's old, outdated knowledge and behaviors and practices. I think so long as there are people who are playing identity politics in the aggressive way, when like the dominant culture is really politicizing our identities, that's what makes us engage in identity politics. So I think as long as that's happening, people should have the right to know who they're doing business with. So they know who they're doing business with me. They see it on the window. They know they're getting ready to patron a queer business person, right? And I think that is a service I provide just in of itself. So people can elect to do business with me or walk by my door and not darken my doorstep, and that's fine. I know I split my potential business pool in half by that. but I know I get more loyalty and more healthy relationships from my customers who do elect to do business with me versus, again, I mentioned if I had been like Morgan's Chocolates and someone who's homophobic or bigoted walking in, I don't want them to make a scene in my space because they didn't know who they were doing business with. If they try to make a scene in my space, knowing who they're doing business with, I get to then be a lot more vocal and pressuring them out versus apologetic, like, oh well, we're just selling chocolates and this just happens to be my wife. That's not the way I would want to do business. I don't need to apologize for that. But I think there are businesses who are taking sides, so to speak, where they're showing solidarity with my business and other queer businesses and other queer nonprofits like Muncie Outreach. You'll see a lot of those stickers up in places, and I think that's healthy, and I think that's good for communities. And so I think seeing more of that has happened in the last few years, and I think part of that too is because of the last presidential administration certainly made people choose their side a lot more. And I think that's toothpaste that's out of the tube. That's not going to change. I don't think the current administration is going to make people return to an apolitical view. I don't think future administrations will do that. I think so long as there is such vast inequality in our society, people are still going to be very political in their businesses and become more so. So I see it as like, honestly, kind of a trend. People are going to be a lot more visible about who they are, what they believe. And I think if you have these beliefs that, if someone is bigoted or racist or transphobic, they should own up to those views and be challenged. And I think if people are supportive, they need to be supportive with their feet and hands and not so much their mouth too. So I would want to see more active support. So long as people have whatever views they have, own them, and then be prepared to be challenged by them, but be prepared to, know that's just how business is going to probably continue to be done.
Most definitely. And I know one question I had was you had mentioned being prepared for potential homophobic reactions to your business. Have you experienced any of those reactions?
No, and I think I'll say no, but there's like one caveat, and I'll put that to the side. But when we started our business, we didn't have a brick and mortar space. We were using a rental kitchen to make truffles, and then I would go to farmers markets and sell truffles. And I remember, Emma, the first day I had to hang up a sign that says queer chocolatier in a Minnetrista farmers market. And I'm like, I felt like I was getting ready to jump into like the ocean off of the edge of a pier. Like I was like, oh, we're doing this. this is happening. And there was a lot of double takes and a lot of like Midwestern passive aggressive, just kind of askance looks and kind of maybe like a mutter under their breath. But those are way outnumbered by the people who were drawn to us. And it wasn't just queer people that were drawn to us as much as like people who were either curious, and that's fine. People can be curious about us. I have no problem with that. But like people would come up and they would just kind of like look at my truffles and they would just kind of look at me and they'd be like, well, my cousin just came out as trans. And I'm like, cool, how have you been supporting them? What do you need to help to support them? And I'm all of a sudden kind of like Lucy from the Peanuts, and I'm like, the psychiatrist is in, and I'm here to like kind of help you through this process. And then people would come up and ask me, what's it mean to be queer? And I kind of tell them from my perspective what it is. And there was a lot more engagement than there was, homophobia. There was certainly nothing that was bad as far as that goes. And so the farmers markets became a place where I became comfortable and I didn't have any concerns about that. And then when we got the space in the village, like the first thing was like, oof, we're going to put queer chocolatier on these windows. Are these windows going to get smashed someday? And, what do we do if, somebody comes in? Do we have to have like a baseball bat on premises or something? Like, I mean, a lot of these things you're kind of thinking about, but I'm like, well, I have insurance. I can get these windows replaced. And, so long as nobody comes in and has any weapon on their person, then we should be fine. And, I think a lot of that was, again, kind of, you kind of work that up worst case scenario in your head, but it never really comes to fruition. And it never really did. And the only things that I experience are like outside, you'll hear like college guys being college guys, and they have to kind of posture with one another. So they'll have like some sort of underhanded, very not original thing to say about queer chocolatier, and I don't care. They can think whatever they want. If they were to come in the shop and say it, there'd be a whole other situation. I think that would be present, especially if there were people there who wanted to be safe. Like that would be a concern. But it never happened. The only thing that was homophobic that I experienced, and I don't think it's, I have a little bit of space now since it's happened, but I did get a phone call from somebody who said they were a Proud Boy, and this was in December. And it's like, for the longest time, I kept the person on the phone for 27 minutes and 11 seconds. And for the first 27 minutes, it was nothing. It was just this guy trying really hard to be misogynistic and body shaming and being concerned about being queer and whether or not God is going to smite me and whatever else. It's again like, hey, I didn't grow up religious, but I've learned a little bit about religion, and I don't think that's the way God works. And so I really just kind of like kept him on the phone, thinking the more he's on the phone with me, the less he's going to be bothering somebody else. So I kind of just wanted to waste his time, because I had my phone and I was just kind of rolling truffles at the same time, and I was being productive and wasting his time at the same time. So but there was a period where he at the very end of the conversation, it sounded like all of a sudden there were like 5 or 6 other voices on the phone, and so that was unsettling for me, because it felt like it hit like my instincts. Like I could tell, I was like, oh no. It's like this feeling of if you were in an alley and you saw there's a lot of people around you kind of feeling. But I mean, ultimately, it was like that moment it happened, and then it went away. And then he hung up on me, which again, I think I still won if he hung up on me. But it was like that was the extent of it. And when I tell people I experience it, then I get that much more support. So like I experienced it, and I told folks, hey, I'm not going to make deliveries today. I'm going to kind of sit down and relax after this. And then people are like, oh my God, I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I think anytime someone is like harassed in that way, it's up to them what they do with their story. But I think in my case, I was able to tell that story because I was not actively harmed, and I felt safe enough to do so. I don't think it's ever incumbent upon a victim to have to tell their story. It's their experience. They can do it, handle it, navigate it the best they can. But I think there are a lot of people who are cis and straight, and they don't know that things still happen to people. So I'm here to, I guess, maybe include part of that in their education as well while I'm here. So, but like I say, otherwise, that's like, if you put this on a scale, like that's so insignificant compared to what I've gotten positively out of it. I think part of it too is being in the Midwest. Like people are not actively and outwardly hostile. They'll probably say something on Facebook. Doesn't hurt me any, I don't care. But I think people are not bold enough to be bigoted in person, which they shouldn't be. They should be ashamed of that. They should not really, have those thoughts in such a way where they, I don't know. I think if you do have those thoughts, it should be consistent. If you do have them, wear them. If you don't have them, don't wear them. But nobody has done that in the Midwest because everybody's so Midwestern that they just can't. But I don't know. I think we've been lucky, but also it's not so much luck as it is just most people generally are probably good.
And I'm curious, as one of my last questions, I know that you've lived in many different places, in Pennsylvania and Minnesota and Texas and here in Indiana. What does it compare in terms of the LGBTQ communities between those spaces? Have you find some spaces more accepting or more challenging to live in?
Yeah, I think so. Like Pennsylvania, I wasn't there long enough to really get much of a sense of it, I don't think. And it's so much of a college dependent town. Where Penn State is, it's in a town called State College. That tells you how much it is like dependent on the university, right? And like the university is like so much more outsized over the community versus how it situates itself in the community. And in grad school, your world is kind of smaller too, because you're just focused so much on your work. So I mean, I think there was a gay bar along kind of like the strip, but it didn't look like it was like always particularly populated. It was just kind of like another bar. But I didn't feel any strong pull or push with regard to the community there. It just felt like a small town. It certainly would not have been tolerated with where I grew up. Like that would have never flown. But like Indy is fairly accepting. Like Indiana as a whole, the state government is not accepting, but Indy is fine. Minneapolis has one of the largest prides in the country, kind of outside of like New York and San Francisco. Minneapolis is right there. I think that's actually called Twin Cities Pride, but it's in Minneapolis. And so in Minneapolis, Sherry and I lived in the neighborhood. So we were in like the center where a lot of queer folk live, and she purposely picked that. She wanted to be in that situation. So a lot of the coffee shops were, decorated with pride flags, and there was a cafe that was owned by gay men, and it was kind of a nice place to be. And she and I, when we'd walk in Minneapolis, we'd hold hands, and that'd be great. In Austin, Austin is supposed to be like this quirky, weird place, and it kind of is, but it didn't have like, it was kind of like Texas in general is kind of like you do you, I do me kind of life. Like it's, to each their own, so to speak. And Austin is still that, but then they just want you to be as weird of being on your own as possible. So there's nobody like, there was never any feeling of like, queerness is not allowed here. And it's celebrated, but it's almost like, oh, that's boring, you're just queer. You have to have something else weird about you to be kind of like pushing that weird boundary of Austin. But so to whatever extent, like I can't really make a judgment on Pennsylvania because I wasn't really there long enough to say. My hometown definitely would have been absolutely homophobic. To this day, it still is. It's also a particularly racist town as well. Indy is fine, but it's situated in a state that's not particularly supportive. Minneapolis is probably, out of all the experiences, probably the most affirming and accepting and what have you. And Austin's just weird. Sherry would love to return to Minneapolis. I think part of that draw is probably that feeling as well. Whereas I would go back to Austin just because I would rather that my queerness not have to be something I have to celebrate all the time. I just want to live my life. But I also don't want to be treated like normal, because normal is not, to even start to have that kind of conversation where you have to situate yourself in comparison to something as normal is not fair in of itself. That's unequal in itself. So, but being in Austin, it's like you are yourself and nobody cares, and that's fine. And I kind of like that feeling. And so, yeah, I think out of the places I'd live, Minneapolis and Austin are probably like on that end of the spectrum. Indianapolis is kind of in the middle towards that spectrum. And probably anything else is probably neutral or to this side. So
Wonderful. And I think that was one of my last questions. Was there anything that we haven't talked about or haven't covered in the interview that you'd like to discuss?
yeah, I think this is something that's been on the top of my mind for a minute. I think about excuse me. Having, ever since I opened Queer Chocolatier, and particularly when I was in the Village, and before the pandemic, but in some cases since, less so just because of the way the pandemic worked, but there would be, I don't want to say daily, because I don't think that's probably the right ratio, but frequently throughout a month, and certainly weekly, at least one phone call, one social media message, one email asking for a job. And I can't hire everybody. I would run out of business if I did. There's also not enough work to just hire everybody. And I think part of that is people in Muncie need a job. College kids need a job, all of that. But I do think there's a lot of it, because I would say 80% or more of the people who asked me for a job led with something about them being queer. So right now I'm reflecting on that process a lot, because I'll be rehiring whenever we open up again. And I'm reflecting on it because it makes me think of how challenging it is to be queer in the workplace. You have to give something up in a lot of ways. You either have to be hiding part of who you are, so you can't be fully authentic in a queer space or in a workplace because you have to hide that. Or if you choose to be fully authentic, you may not get the job. Or if you get the job, you may be passed up for opportunities to improve and be promoted. Or you may experience discrimination while you're there, or you're harassed in some way while you're there. So I think it's really been something I'm thinking a lot about, with what's it like to be in the LGBTQ community and be in the workplace or be in the workforce, or hunting for work. So early on, I processed it as like, oh, a lot of queer kids see that I'm a queer business and they want to be hired here. That's very flattering, and it makes me think that, oh, I'm doing something right. But it kind of shook out that I'm thinking, well, it's really a lot of workplaces not doing it right. And I don't know how to fix that other than to continue to be visible as a workplace, to kind of have that contrast. But I anguish thinking about, especially, I'll tell you what I really anguish about is, I have now taken up this space as a queer businesswoman. I've shown people what it's like to be a transparent space. But I don't want people who are queer thinking, oh, if Morgan did it, I can do it, because there's a lot of reasons why it can't be done. And there's a lot of things that worked for me that made it work, that I don't want somebody to be thinking it's going to work and they fail and not know why. So like, we would not be able to do this job if Sherry didn't have an income. I'm not paying myself in this business. This business is not in a position where it's profitable enough to do it. And part of that is me. I'm not particularly great at business. I'm just good at making chocolate and being funny and hanging out with queer kids. But like the business part of it, I don't know how to, well, it's capitalism. I don't know how to win the game of capitalism yet. But I think if someone wanted to try to be a queer business person and they didn't have like a partner who had a source of income, or if they didn't have access to capital, or if they didn't have something else that really, made it where they could do a small business, I don't want them to feel like it's their fault that they couldn't do it, because that's just how capitalism is working. So I anguish over that. And I anguish over that idea of younger people now knowing who they are, and they're getting ready to go into the world, particularly in the workforce, and they've understood who they are, and they can't hide that now. Like, you can't take that back. You can't push that back. Once you know who you are, you really don't want to shave off the corners of who you are. That's going to lead to more mental health issues. That's going to lead to more poverty issues. If people can't find work because workplaces are not accommodating to who people are, then there's going to be a lot of extreme poverty that comes from that. So all of that's very salient, particularly because in a pandemic, jobs are scarce and people are being evicted even though they shouldn't be. And so that's kind of like, I feel like our queer community has done a lot to like celebrate the notion of acceptance, but I don't know if acceptance is as important as being like safe. Like the hierarchy of needs, like people need to have a job they can rely on. They need to have housing. I don't really care about like pride until those things are fixed. So
Most definitely, most definitely. And I really appreciate you contributing that to the conversation. I think that's really important to include. And it offers a really interesting perspective at this historical moment of time that we're living in as well. In bringing the interview to a close, is there anyone else that you recommend that we speak to for this project?
I mean, Sherry's good. I love her, and I love that her experience um is considerably different than mine. And I think she offers
um,
A strong contrast of my experience in a lot of ways, but also she can echo and kind of fit a different perspective of people too. So um, I will throw her under the bus and have her talk to you. um, I think, and you're speaking mostly to Muncie folk, right?
Mostly to Muncie and people in the area.
I would say, um, I would say this is a tricky question too, because you certainly don't want to out anybody. But I'm trying to think of like other people who might have a good story to tell. Let me follow up with you.
That sounds like a great plan. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Thank you so much for participating in this interview for the Muncie LGBTQ History Project. I'm going to go ahead and conclude the interview now. I really appreciate your time and help in support of this project, and it was wonderful speaking to you today.
Thanks, Emma. And thanks for your patience with my phone not cooperating the entire time. But I hope I was
No
able to
worries.
give perspective to your study, and I hope that you've learned a lot in the process with conducting these interviews. So good luck to you.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and pause the recording and stop it.